As you know, these journals both published poetry and fiction alongside essays, different forms of writing, anthropological writing, sometimes history writing, reportage, sometimes in Mensaging, and speeches, and became key platforms for writers and activists involved in African independence struggles, both on their pages and in their offices and buildings as physical meeting spaces, and at their conferences. And so my project is based in archival work and takes a kind of transnational and comparative approach to look at the journals together and at the connections between them, but also tries to reactivate both the texts of those journals to think about their continued resonance today. And so I kind of mix kind of close readings of the journals with chapters which are more focused on contemporary bodies of work about literature and politics. So it's not a kind of comprehensive history. Underpinning my overall argument is an argument about the significance of the literary journal as a key form in the development of African writing in French, Portuguese, and English. And post-colonial studies has tended to emphasize the place of the novel in literary histories of African decolonization, drawing a link between the novel form and nationalist consciousness. But as you know, and I think as your group in particular knows, journals proliferated too in the high water years of decolonization, and I'm suggesting should be understood as a literary form in its own right. And what's interesting about that are the fact that these are collective forms. That's one of the things that interests me most about it. So what was it about the journal form that produced the internationalist sensibilities and kind of expansive analyses of the imperial world that we see on their pages? And so one of the basic things I suppose I'm saying in the book, and this is based in these readings of these two journals, as I suppose kind of particularly illustrative examples of these dynamics. But what I'm saying is that these journals are articulated forms, and I take that concept of articulation from the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who speaks about articulation as a way of thinking about contingent connections that can make unities of different things for a certain time. So that there's a sense of transience there. So in particular, I think about connections that the journals establish between politics and culture, but I'm not saying that these are the fixed relationships between politics and culture forever and ever, amen. I'm saying that these were the particular constellations that were established by these journals at this time. So I'm thinking about articulation in the sense of connection, that the collective form of these journals established connections between different things. Firstly, between writing from different parts of the colonized world in a basic sense. And secondly, in their juxtaposition of kind of poetic or literary work, and I mean that in the broadest possible sense, with the non-literary or the non-poetic, in their juxtaposition of poetry and short stories alongside other forms of writing, manifestos, conference proceedings, essays, reportage, etc. Maria Lugones has argued that at the heart of anti-colonial praxis is a critique of colonial optics, which, and I'm quoting here, organizes the world ontologically in terms of atomic, homogeneous, separable categories. And I'm suggesting that these journals, we can understand them as formalizing this critique through their juxtaposition, through their juxtapositive kind of connective logics. And that this was kind of effected through techniques of juxtaposition and translation. So so they connected both different parts of the world and different spheres of social life, most notably the cultural and the political. And this kind of anti-colonial comparative sensibility produced a powerful analytic for understanding different European colonialisms together, not in mononational, mono-imperialist terms as kind of disaggregated, so French colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, British colonialism, So not as separate, but materially, ideologically, and structurally connected. So this kind of anticipates what more recently some scholars have called an analysis of co-colonialism. And I think that this is actually, I'll come on to this later, but I think this is particularly, this is a particularly charged maneuver in the Portuguese context because of the Estado Novo's sort of exceptionalism, that, or sense that what was going on in the Portuguese colonies was not the same as what was going on in the French or British colonies. I'll come on to that. So these two forms of, so I'm saying that the significance of these journals is maybe most suggestively approached through those two elements of their connective, articulated form. But there's a third thing that I want to add into the mix, and that is the dissonance and dissidence of the collective form. So you might read a journal, and I will explain a bit more about this in a second, but they are sites of disagreement and of polyphony as well as consensus. And that strikes me as a particularly important quality of their form today, when because the kind of enduring valencies of anti-colonial struggles today seems to me to extend beyond the perceived intellectual figureheads and leaders that have been almost anthologized as spokespersons for that moment in anti-colonial history. And so if we want to recover the collective gesture of anti-colonial praxis, then journals seem a very suggestive form from which to begin, because it gets us past this kind of individualism of, you know, the great thinkers, for all that they too were published on those pages. Okay, let me just show you the contents page. So the book is divided into two parts, and the first part of the book, part one, mainly focuses on the journal's dominant articulations, which I will talk about in a second. And so particularly ideas about politics and culture, changing ideas about politics and culture, and the relationships between writing, reading, and political transformation. And then in part two, I talk about what I figure as the kind of minor voices. So the sort of the smaller pieces that you know, someone might write one poem on one page, and that's quite different from some of the more established voices that we see, particularly in Presence Africaine. So there's a kind of major and minor division. So let me just keep going with my logic of doing chapter by chapter. So in chapter one, kind of fleshes out some of the ideas that I've already mentioned. So chapter one talks about these connections between different languages and different places, and then the connections between literary and non-literary work. And I think talking about Presence Africaine in particular, I think it's important to say that Presence Africaine is conventionally considered a francophone publication, but from their very first edition, in an editorial published in both French and English, the editor Alioune Diop announced the journal's intention to move past what he called the confines of French civilization in order to study the general problem of Europe's relations with the rest of the world. So even though you know, that it's now thought of as a francophone publication, it from the very beginning disavowed this sense of wanting to be confined to a language world. And the journal's project of developing strategies of translation across the lines of power of national colonial languages took the form between 1955 and 1961 of also publishing an English edition, also entitled Presence Africaine, which ran to 60 issues, 60. And even after they stopped publishing articles in English, they carried on for a long time translating editorials into French and English, and also publishing summaries of French language articles in English. And the editors drew a connection between their commitment to translation, and and their Pan-Africanist ethos. So they write, by employing the English and French languages, we hope to assist our friends elsewhere to understand the legitimacy of the African aspiration to independence and unity. And in that sense, I think it's really important to see Presence Africaine as kind of taking forward the tradition pioneered in particular by Paulette and Jeanne Nardal at La Revue du Monde Noir in Paris, of practicing Black internationalism as bilingualism, which is Brent Hayes Edwards' turn of phrase. And on this slide, I've put these pictures of the first Congress of Black Writers and Artists in Paris in 1946. On the left, these are quite well-known pictures, and if you've encountered that conference, which I'm sure many of you have, you might have seen these photographs before. But one of the things that interests me about them is the wearing of headphones, both at the bottom, in the bottom picture, that's Richard Wright, the African-American writer, wearing headphones next to Alioune Diop and others. And then above in the audience, you see all these pictures of people wearing headphones, which is a kind of inscribes the live effort of interpretation that is going on at the moment and going on during that conference, and I suppose illustrates that multilingual Pan-Africanism that Presence Africaine sought to take forward. Looking at Mensagem on the right, Mensagem was obviously operating in quite different circumstances, as I'm sure you know. It was difficult for writers to write exactly what they wanted to. The journal was under surveillance. It wasn't always possible to say exactly what they wanted to say. But then in this last edition of Mensagem, I've put this up because I think Mensagem is sometimes called upon as a kind of crucible of a nascent kind of Lusophone imaginary, and certainly in the celebrations of Mensagem that accompanied, a few, it must have been now over 5 years ago, but around the 50 years of the Casa, there were all these programs and reeditions of the Casa's books and so on, and that was very much couched as a celebration of the kind of history of the Lusophone and of a Lusophone community. But what we see in looking at this contents page is not a bounded Lusophone imagination, but rather a kind of a collection of Portuguese language texts that sort of read together seek to address different situations, the different situations across the Portuguese Empire and beyond. So, for example, you can see here I've put arrows. Un documento is a translation of an account, a testimony of a Malawian herbalist, James Sadika, who had been imprisoned and arrested, and tried by the South African government, and it was a kind of it was an indictment of apartheid, and that was published on page 16. And then this, you see halfway down, Uniões Nacionais de Estudantes em África, that was a kind of a manifesto of resolutions published by student unions in Africa. And then at the bottom, a translation of the South American poet Richard Reeves, Where the Rainbow Ends. So all of these are sort of cracks, bubbling up through the moments of dissent bubbling up through the cracks. But what I'm saying is that even in the kind of more constrained publishing contexts of Lisbon in 1964, still the kind of editorial thrust was not to understand the question of empire in language specific or kind of national specific terms, but as a broader global dynamic. Okay, I mean, we could talk more about this, particularly in Presence Africaine. Alioune Diop theorized at great length the extent to which, for him, anti-colonialism involved a kind of political and editorial commitment to overcoming European divisions between imperial projects. Okay, zooming on, of these characters that I'm sure you'll have come across before: Mário Pinto Andrade, Alda do Espírito Santo, Amílcar Cabral, Noemi de Sousa, Agostinho Neto, and Francisco José Tenreiro, which in chapter 2, when I'm talking about questions of critical reading, I draw a lot on their accounts of the Centro de Estudos Africanos that they established between them, and where they talk a lot about critical pedagogy and critical reading, but I'm going to zoom ahead. So this is the penultimate edition of Mensagem, which appeared of April 1963. And in that edition, one thing that appears is Francisco José Tenreiro's essay, Processo Poesia. And in it, he kind of gives an account of kind of what he says is that poets shouldn't engage in escapism or kind of imaginative flights of fancy, and he disparages what he calls the poesia do jardim das flores, sort of poetry of flower gardens, and he says rather the true poet reflete os próprios aspectos da vida, and the poet is político. So this kind of explains for Tenreiro why the Estado Novo had imprisoned so many African poets, and so he's making this kind of case in quite strong terms for a kind of engaged poetic stance that is realist, and none of this flower poetry. So that's one thing. So we read that, but then a few pages later we encounter these other poems. So on the one hand we have Luandino Vieira's Bougainvillea and Girassões, which are two kind of imagistic poems ostensibly about flowers that were published whilst he was in prison, and that there's no way of reading them other than incredibly politically charged and critical poems that nevertheless that kind of, I suppose what they do is that they use the kind of the trope of flowers to make a really strong political point, and so in some ways reimagine what that poetry of flowers might consist of. And then on the other hand, in the same edition, we also have this poem by Manuela Margarido, which again uses this imagery of flowers to rewrite the history of her mother, a kind of silenced Black woman. And so this is also, I mean, we could talk about these poems at length, but both of these poems reinscribe the question of what the poetry of flowers might be. And so the question then is, and this is what I mean by dissensus and the poetry and their journal form. We could, on the one hand, I mean, I suppose we have to read these texts connectively. So we have José Tenreiro, Francisco Tenreiro saying no poetry of flowers, and then we have these poetry of flowers, and it's that kind of dissensus that I think is so suggestive in thinking about the journal form. But I guess does raise a lot of questions about how we read those. And I mean, I guess in thinking about them, I mean, there's a question of kind of methodologically, what do you do? And one thing is that the editors of Mensagem again and again sort of insist that they want their magazine to be read as a whole, and that it needs to be read as a kind of whole form, and then that becomes this form that kind of encloses dissensus. But then I've also been quite influenced, I suppose, by Peter Thomas's writing about Gramsci, in which he argues that he kind of thinks about how to reckon with the censorship under which the prison notebooks in particular were produced. And he kind of argues that the new concepts that Gramsci develops in his text shouldn't be read as kind of code words for something else, so Marxism by another name, but need to be read in terms of the particular vocabulary that was produced under the pressure of censorship in that place. And so he's sort of saying we should attend closely to what was written rather than just imagining what he might have written in other circumstances. And I guess I found that reflection helpful in thinking about how to parse these sort of poems in the context of their surrounding literary critical discourses. And I guess in their articulation of in their kind of rewriting of flower poetry, they show that the poetry of flowers precisely can be powerful in particular contexts and with particular readerships. And they also kind of insist on a certain kind of aesthetic openness to how to kind of approaching the political. And so that kind of polyphony kind of reminds us of the kind of the question of method in thinking about these journals and how we put these different things together. Okay, there's a lot more to say, but in the first in chapter, I can't remember where I am, 5, I discussed the changing articulations of kind of multilingual negritude with changing conceptions of politics over the 1950s and 1960s. So rather than, the classic story of negritude is that it, Césaire, Damas, and Senghor kind of birthed it, and then they were the kind of that's the classic story. But I guess what I'm trying to do is reread negritude as underpinned by journal culture. And so I treat it as polyphonic, i.e. that it was articulated by many people, because those terms became so operative that they were used by hundreds of writers in lots of different ways, that didn't necessarily correlate to the ways in which Senghor and Césaire and Damas used it, and anyway, all the three of them had quite different conceptions about what the word meant. So polyphonic, diachronic, in the sense that it evolved, like what that word meant in the 1930s was not the same as what it meant in the 1960s, and multilingual. So its protagonists were not only French speaking. So I take it as a polyphonic, diachronic, and multilingual cultural and social phenomenon that was underpinned by journal culture. And so in that sense, I treat negritude in these journals not as a literary cultural phenomenon with kind of fixed political implications, but rather as articulated to the changing political visions of the 1950s and 60s. And so I've got here the 1953 edition of Poesia Negra de Expressão Portuguesa that was edited by Mário Pinto Andrade and Francisco Tenreiro, to illustrate as one way into thinking about the ways that negritude was taken up and, well, I guess adopted and adapted in Lisbon. And this chapter is kind of episodic. So I talk about Lisbon 1953, 1963 to 1964, the Third World Project, 1966 to 1968, socialist revolution in Cuba, and then Algiers in 1969. So in some ways, this depasses the kind of Mensaging alone, but those debates carried on extensively in Presence Africaine. I think about the women that were published in both journals, and then I also think about the women that weren't published in either journal. And so I think about divisions of labor. I think about what kind of divisions of labor underpinned both journals. And I mean, one thing really stuck with me throughout my writing that chapter, which was an encounter I had in the archives in Caen in Normandy, when I was looking at the archives of Presence Africaine. And there in the boxes, there are letters and letters and letters from would-be novelists, from men writing in with their manuscripts, kind of saying, here is my new manuscript, it's really great, please publish it, I'm really amazing writer. And some of them even say things like, I'm really sorry this is late, my wife has just taken so long to type this up, I'm really sorry. So there's this scene of on the one hand, and then on the other hand there are all these letters from women proposing themselves as translators, saying please take me on as a translator, or I've translated this thing, would you like me to, could you publish it? And so I guess that drew my attention to the question of divisions of labor, and particularly between different types of textual practice, and between who who got to appear as author or not in both journals. And we can speak at greater length about both of these. But I guess one thing I do in that chapter is talk about Noemi Souza as a translator and as a mediator in the years after she sort of stopped writing, I guess. And then I also attend to things like letters, not just to those archival letters that I've spoken about, but also letters, for example, that were sent around the conferences that Presence Africaine wrote in and that were published in the journal. And I use those archival scraps alongside the writing that was published in the journal to argue that women writing in both journals kind of sought to expand and rewrite single scale and gender neutral kind of anti-colonial paradigms, and offered a kind of new articulation of scale, gender and place. And so I guess in kind of recent discussions of anti-colonialism, the one scale has come to dominate those discussions, and that's the scale of the world, as Musab Yunus puts it, and many scholars make this argument for the importance of understanding the globality of anti-colonial thought, which is a very important argument. But I guess reading the women writing in both of these journals reminds us that that scales are connected, and that the multiscalarity that we see in these women's writing was a strategy for allowing them to write their own experience and their own, particularly the domestic, into dominant grand scale discussions of world transformation. And such a strategy of multiscalarity might still offer us important ways forward today. Okay, I know I'm going very fast here. I'm sure you have questions, but just to say that in the final chapter, I take up this kind of call for multiscalarity that I read in these women's writing, to think more broadly about the scale and sort of ideas about space we see in both journals. And so I read a lot of poetry about and think about the different kind of ideas of space that and of the world that we see in those texts. And then finally, I kind of make an argument about the need, about, I suppose, what is at stake in doing comparative work, because I think in this, what I kind of try to suggest is that this connective form is also, we can think of it as a comparative practice that is based in an understanding that the kind of imperial condition was something that connected different parts of the world. And so I suppose when I first started writing this book, there was a real sense of language-specific post-colonial studies proliferating in kind of relationships of genealogy and counterpoint to kind of the dominant field of Anglophone post-colonial studies. And so there's all this, there was all this pushback against the kind of the explanatory power of Anglophone theory to explain the rest of the world. And everyone, there was a lot of, this doesn't apply to the Portuguese case, this doesn't apply to the French case, this doesn't apply to the Italian, Spanish, German, Belgian, Dutch, etc., case. And whilst I think that was an important kind of counterpoint, I think that there are two things. The first is that the intertextuality we see on the pages of these journals evidently complicates any convenience of mind that the kind of Francophone, Lusophone, Hispanophone, Anglophone are hermetic categories that can be kind of held apart and stably apart. But secondly, I think writers in both journals kind of offer us ways of understanding what is at stake and understanding those apparent separable, those worlds together in ways that might provide powerful analytics for understanding both the kind of history of and mercurial afterlives of empire today. I'll stop there. That was very quick, but voila. Thank you.